All right, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Jill McCleary, and I am the Deputy Director and Acting Head for the University of Arizona Museum of Art. And as I said, we're just really happy to have all of you joining us today. It's such a pleasure to see familiar faces and familiar names joining us, and just so glad to have you here. For those of you that are on our email list or watching our social media, you've seen that the staff at UAMA has been very busy working from home during this time to try to bring things to you virtually. And so I want to make sure I take a moment to thank the incredible staff at the museum, and also thank our leadership council, our docents, our volunteers, our interns, for all of your support. It really means the world to us. And especially big thank you to our museum members, because really we can only do programs like this because of your financial support. So thank you very much. Before we continue in this virtual environment, I do want to acknowledge that the University of Arizona sits on the original homelands of Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Aligning with the university's core value of a diverse and inclusive community, it is an institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up the Wildcat community. At the institutional level, it is important to be proactive in broadening awareness throughout campus to ensure our students feel represented and valued. So as we go through today, I'll ask that you keep your microphones muted, please. There is a chat box where you can enter questions that can be answered at the end of the presentation. We have about 1 hour total for the presentation, and if you put in questions into the chat box while Olivia's talking, we're going to do our best to get those answered for you. I do suggest that you switch your view to speaker view if you're currently in gallery view. So for those of you that maybe are less familiar with Zoom, that usually is up in the upper right-hand side of the screen. And so if it says gallery view right now, you can push that button and it will switch to speaker view. And that should help a little bit. Of course, if you have any issues or if you're having trouble hearing or seeing anything, please put something in the chat box and either myself or one of our co-hosts from the staff will help you out with that. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Olivia Miller. I've had the great pleasure of working alongside Olivia for 8 years now. And I think this is the first time we've ever done a virtual event together. So that's new and exciting. But I have gotten to hear Olivia talk about her collection many, many times. And I can tell you it never gets old. So I'm really looking forward to the talk. I hope you are too. Thanks so much for coming. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our Curator of Exhibitions, Olivia Miller.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm just going to backtrack slightly to this slide. I'm delighted to have this time to revisit one of the gems of the collection of the University of Arizona Museum of Art. We're really lucky to have this work in our collection, and I will talk a little bit more about why we're so lucky and how it is that it came to be, that it came to our collection. It's a bit strange to be talking about these paintings on Zoom, partly because these paintings are on permanent display at our museum. So under normal circumstances, a talk like this would be given in the gallery, surrounded by the paintings. And, you know, I've had the great fortune to see these paintings almost every day for the past 8 years, and I really am missing them. So it sounds a little silly, but it's true. But I thought it fitting to talk about the altarpiece for a couple of reasons. So as I mentioned, it's one of the gems of the UAMA collection. So it is an artwork that people come to our museum specifically to see. People have come from Spain, from the church where these paintings originally hung to see the paintings at our museum. And so we like to revisit them from time to time in our programming because they are so important to our collection. The second reason that I wanted to give this talk today, and probably the most relevant for considering the time that we're in, is I feel like these paintings have taken on new relevance and are going to continue to take on new relevance in light of all that's happening in our world today. The reason I think that is that one of the positive things that's going to come out of this very strange and scary time that we're living in is that there's going to be a whole new wave of artistic creations that we can't even begin to fully imagine right now. And that's exciting to me because that's what big world events do. And that's what makes artists so incredibly important to our world, because they are the people who have the imagination, the creativity, the intelligence, and the wherewithal to be able to articulate what is fearful and what is uncertain. And they have this ability to visualize things that we don't necessarily have the verbal language for. And once we can visualize something, we can get a better grip on it, and we can reconcile it, or we can critique it. And it's no different than these artists, Fernando Gallego and Master Bartolome. They were doing very similar things. And we'll talk a little bit about why their world was also a bit scary and uncertain. So that's really the main reason why I wanted to give this talk. So let's get going. So before I really get into the talk, I just want to clarify a bit about the language I'll be using. I don't even realize I'm doing it, but I use the word altarpiece and retablo interchangeably. They essentially mean the same thing. So when I'm using the word retablo derives from the Latin retro tabula. So retro meaning behind or back. Today, we often use that word to mean something in the past. You know, that's so retro. So it's still a word that comes up. And then tabula refers to a table or a board. And in this case, by extension, an altar. So when I'm talking about a retablo, I'm literally talking about a work of art that hangs behind the altar. I also want to mention this word because when I'm talking about this retablo in particular, this is a Spanish retablo, and it's a genre in Spain that refers to very large altarpieces, and that's a little bit different from the way that the word can be used in Mexico or in the United States, where retablos can often reference you know, small, more votive type artworks that are often displayed in a home or in a shrine, still with religious purposes, but they're more votive in function and definitely on a smaller scale. So I just wanted to clarify that as I go through. Okay, so I want to situate us in the original location where these paintings were displayed. So you'll notice I used the background as well. I'm trying to imagine myself in Ciudad Rodrigo in front of the church. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you the Cathedral of Ciudad Rodrigo. So this is the original location where these paintings used to hang. The cathedral was, construction started in the 12th century in the Romanesque style. So hopefully you can see my cursor, but down here at the bottom near the door, we have sort of the hallmarks of the Romanesque style, the rounded arches and these multiple portal system that you see here. But you can also see there are numerous changes in the masonry, numerous changes in the style, and as is so common with most cathedrals in Europe, you know, a cathedral wasn't built in a short amount of time, and so it often took a number of centuries and thereby took on different styles. So although the cathedral had been there for a couple of centuries, our paintings did not hang there until the late 15th century. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you a map of the Iberian Peninsula. So you can think of that as roughly modern-day Spain and Portugal. And I'm showing you this. This will come into play later in my talk when I talk about some of the things that are going on in Spain at the time that our retablo was created. What I want you to just keep in mind for the moment is the location of Ciudad Rodrigo. So there's a little green circle there that shows you where it's located. And take note that it is quite close to the border with the Kingdom of Portugal. It's also quite close to the much larger city of Salamanca, which at this time was a major city. It had, and still does, has a major university there that had been around since the 13th century. And that's gonna be important when thinking about the context of our artists in particular. The other thing I just want you to take note of is that Spain is not a unified country at this time. It's not a unified country for a very long time. and at this point in time, it's comprised of a number of different kingdoms. And again, I'll revisit the kingdoms and why that's significant later in my talk. So as I'm talking, I just want to play this video. If you've never been to our museum before, you might not have an understanding of what it actually looks like to see the retablo. The other thing I should make note of is that sometimes I refer to it as a single object and sometimes I refer to it in the plural. And that's because it's a really difficult thing to talk about. The retablo, or the altarpiece, is a single work of art, yet it's comprised of 26 different paintings, 26 surviving paintings, I should say. So sometimes I do talk about it in both the singular and the plural, and I apologize if that gets a little bit confusing. But when you come to our museum, they're displayed in a single gallery, and you're looking at them totally dissected. And what I mean by that is that they are disassembled, they are unframed, so they originally would have been framed, and they're also hanging at the typical museum eye level. So that places the paintings very close to the viewer. It's really an incredible thing to be able to sit on a bench in the middle of this gallery and just be completely enveloped by these paintings. And while that is wonderful, it's not at all how it was originally intended to be seen. And that's not at all the experience of the 15th century viewer. So one thing I want to make mention of is how incredible it is that our museum has these paintings, and the fact that they survive in such a large number and that they're localized into one specific collection. So 26 panels survive. There certainly would have been more, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But we're very lucky to have them all together in our collection because in the 18th and 19th centuries in particular, altarpieces were often essentially chopped up and sold for parts. So they would be disassembled and individual paintings would be sold to museums or private collectors. Even nowadays, it's still usually easier to sell a smaller work of art, you know, something that can be displayed in the home, and it makes it more affordable to sell it. Our museum has a number of fragments of larger altarpieces. So I'm showing you an example of just one. Over here on the left is this beautiful triptych called Pietà. We can see that Christ has been taken down from the cross. He has two angels supporting him, and then he's flanked by the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist. And when you come to our museum and see this hanging on the wall, it's a really beautiful work of art, and it holds its own. It seems like a complete composition. In reality, it's actually a fragment of a larger altarpiece. So on the right-hand side, I'm showing you a reconstruction of what this altarpiece could have looked like. So it was originally created for a church in Fermo, Italy, which is sort of in central Italy, but on the East Coast. And you can see that our triptych is actually just one portion of a much larger altarpiece. The other large panels you see here are at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and there's a number of smaller panels that have just been lost or have probably ended up in private hands. So I just really want to underscore the fact that these 26 paintings that are of a large size actually stayed together is really, really special. So we're very fortunate to have it at the University of Arizona. So thinking about what the 15th century viewer would have experienced, obviously we're separated by a number of centuries, so we can only make certain assumptions, but we're really fortunate that some of the retablos in Spain are still in situ, meaning that they are still in the location that they were always intended to be in. And what's very lucky for us is that our artists, Fernando Gallegos and Master Bartolome, did collaborate on another retablo. I'm showing you a picture right here. So this one's a little bit smaller than ours. This one has about 25 panels, not including the large sculptural centerpiece of it. We have 26 panels that survive. We know there would have been at least 5 more. So you can imagine the size of our retablo is at least 1 row taller than this one. So it gives us a fairly good sense of scale that it would have risen a couple of stories. And just to situate you, here's the altar. So somebody standing here would be approximately right here. So a very large work of art. It also gives you an idea of the display. You know, in our gallery, we have the panels hanging side by side, evenly spaced. Really, they would have been framed in gilded wooden frames, and they would have been arranged in a grid format. And so, again, by looking at this retablo, we can get an understanding of what ours would have looked like. The other thing I want to stress is that viewing artwork in a church would have been a multi-sensory experience. And that's something that no museum can fully replicate. So obviously, being in a church, there would have been a communal aspect. So people would not be viewing this by themselves. They would be surrounded by people. There would be smells from incense. You can see incense burners right here in this church. There would have been flickering candlelight, so the paintings would have been much more animated. There would have been sounds, of course, you know, spoken word or song. And so it wasn't just the retablo, it was this entire physical experience of being in the church and being with people and viewing it together that really would have made it an incredible sight. The other thing that would have made it especially incredible for people is that it was a rare opportunity. So unlike today, where if the museum was open, we could in theory go and see these paintings almost every day. That was not the case for the 15th century person. It's a little bit different than many cathedrals nowadays that keep their doors open and allow people and tourists to come in and view artworks at many hours of the day. The retablo was kept covered most of the time and was only revealed on certain holidays. And so this is a big production and one that's mediated by the church in terms of how people experienced the viewing of these artworks. So it would have been a big deal. And I think it's important to also keep in mind that people would not have had access to the images the way that we do today with phones and televisions and all sorts of media that we're surrounded by. It just was not the same. So to have the chance to see an artwork would have been a really big deal for people. So I just want to show you a couple of other retablos just so you can get an idea of what other ones look like. This one is made a little bit later than ours. And this one is not paintings. It's actually wooden painted sculpture, so Polychrome sculpture. This is a type of artwork that's very popular in Spain. And there were definitely master workshops that taught this sort of artwork. So this is just one other type. Whoops. And then we have, of course, the one in the Cathedral of Salamanca, which is just absolutely massive. It's twice the size of ours. So this has about 50 panels in it. So very, very large. And again, you know, I think it still gives you an idea of what it looks like together as a single work of art being, you know, hanging and framed together. But again, this one's very large. Here you can see a microphone and a podium. So somebody standing here would be right at the bottom. I want you to take note of this bottom part right here. This is what's referred to as the banco or the predella. So our retablo did have a predella, and we know that because a few of the paintings do survive. So here, I'm showing you three of those paintings, and certainly there would have been 6 in total because we would have had all 12 of Jesus's disciples depicted. So here we have 6. They're really, really beautiful paintings, and I'll talk a little bit about one of them in just a moment. So at the very least, we know that there would have been 3 additional banco panels. We also know a lot about the intended narrative because much of it survives, thankfully. So our retablo, narratively speaking, according to the biblical narrative, begins here with this very bizarre painting on the left-hand side called Chaos. So Chaos was created by Bartolome, and I'll talk more about it later in this presentation as well. But this you can essentially think of as the beginning of everything. So it's God the Father creating the universe and the earth. The cycle of our paintings ends with the Last Judgment. So it's essentially Christ coming back for the second coming and judging the living and the dead. Now, there are, for the most part, the narrative is about Jesus, but there are two panels from what is referred to as the Old Testament. So again, on the left, we have chaos, so that's from the book of Genesis, and then we also have the creation of Eve. So the creation of Eve, I'll talk about this one later too, but it's such a wonderful painting to look at. There's so many things to see, and it's really a fantastic work. But what gets weird is that then it jumps, again, with the narrative from the creation of Eve, and all of a sudden we're at the circumcision, where Christ is getting circumcised. So this makes no sense whatsoever. This is not good storytelling. So what this tells us is that we are definitely missing some paintings here. We can assume there's at least one or two that would have been in addition to these. So we have the creation of Eve, but we don't have the creation of Adam. We don't have a scene of the original sin where they're taking the apple from the snake. So maybe those narratives were included. There certainly would have been another image of Christ as an infant. It wouldn't just go straight to a circumcision. There was probably almost certainly a nativity scene of some kind where he would have just been born and everyone and all the animals are coming to visit him. So we can make certain assumptions that, you know, there's somewhere between 5 and 8 panels maybe missing in our retablo. But as I mentioned, the narrative mostly talks about, it's mostly concerned with the life of Jesus. So it details select events in his life, certain miracles he performed, and then it also goes through all of the steps of the Passion and then ends with the Last Judgment. Our retablo was made by 2 artists and their workshops. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you Fernando Gallego. And then on the right-hand side, I'm showing you Master Bartolome. And at first glance, these might look like the same artist. And that was certainly the intention of the artists, is that they wanted their styles to be close enough to where this retablo could be seen and appreciated as a single work of art. However, what art historians do is they look closely at artwork and they make discoveries that aren't necessarily visible the first time looking at it. That's why it's so important to spend a lot of time with the work of art, because you can always see something new. And one of the things they knew right off the bat was that Fernando Gallego was one of the artists. And they knew that because there's an early document from the 17th century that talks about how there was an inscription on one of the panels that talks about Fernando Gallego and how he made these panels from 1480 to 88. And that seemed not really in dispute because it corresponds to his style. He was a major painter in Salamanca. He had other commissions for other altarpieces. And so that seemed all fine. But what was strange is that there was clearly other hands at work. And that's where it wasn't until the technical study done in 2008 by the Kimball Art Museum and the Meadows Museum and the Getty Research Institute that they discovered that the second major artist was Master Bartolome. So one of the things you can see is if you take a look at the face of Christ and compare the two, you'll notice that things like the beard is different. You'll also notice in the halo, this is more of a diamond shape, whereas this one is more of an even radiation from around his head. So it's details like this that art historians were able to pick up on to tell that there were multiple hands at work doing slightly different things. There's other things that you can look at, including hands, drapery, the way the landscape is done, details of the trees. There's all of these little sort of codes. And then to top it off, the beautiful thing about the world today is that we have really incredible technology for art historical research. And so art historians and art conservators can work together to come up with a lot of these conclusions together. And that's exactly what happened in 2008. So they're able to take infrared reflectograms, which you can sort of think of like an X-ray, and you can compare the underdrawings of the 2 artists and realize that they're sketching things out differently. So all of these clues, have helped contribute to our knowledge about these paintings. So I'll start with just a little bit about Fernando Gallegos. So I had mentioned that he was based in Salamanca. It's quite possible that he was born there. He certainly lived a good part of his career there. I'm showing you really sort of the gem that is his painting style. He did all of the portraits of these saints, and they are just absolutely stunning and so full of detail. What you are missing in this flat image on a computer screen is the fact that the entire background is actually gold leaf, and it's full of really incredible punch work. I'm not sure if you can tell that there are some designs here, some geometric and foliate designs, and so these really just sparkle and shimmer in really wonderful ways. But Gallegos from Salamanca, I mentioned that he was commissioned to do a number of altarpieces, and he's one of the few artists at this time that's actually known by name in Spain, which is a little bit shocking in some ways because, you know, it's fairly late in the 15th century. But there's a couple reasons for this. One is that a lot of the artists at this time were still operating under the medieval tradition of not signing or laying claim to their artwork. That, of course, will begin to change. A lot of it has to do with just record keeping was not what it was, especially prior to bound books becoming really, really prevalent. Record keeping just wasn't great. So there's a lot of documents that have certainly been lost. There also just simply were not a lot of painters in Spain at this time. And I'm speaking comparatively to countries like Italy or Germany. There just were fewer artists painting in Spain. There were a lot of sculptors, just not as many artists. And in many of the Spanish courts were bringing in artists from other countries to do their court portraits and things like that. The other thing that's also pretty interesting is that a lot of paintings have probably been misattributed, and instead of being assigned as a work by a Spanish artist have been assigned as a work by a Flemish artist or a French artist. And that's because there's so much blending of styles at this time. Fernando Gallego worked in what's called the Hispano-Flemish style. And so it takes tendencies from both Spain and also the area of Flanders, which you can think of as modern day Belgium. And so there's a lot of transferring of ideas, and that can make it very tricky to attribute the work. Long story short, Fernando Gallego is one of the few known painters at this time. And it's no surprise that he would have been, you know, given a commission like this. And while we don't know the details of his life, whoops. I'll just go back real quick. Sorry, my PowerPoint has large images in it, and so it's clicking kind of slowly. What we can tell is, you know, some details about the way he ran his workshop. So I'm showing you here the betrayal of Christ, and sorry for the very grotesque detailed image, but I have a point to prove. But in this painting, you know, what happens over time to paint layers is even when paintings are in very good condition and kept in temperature controlled museums, there's still always going to be an amount of degradation that occurs throughout time. That's just the nature of artwork. And the best we can do is try to stall it as much as possible, but ultimately these things do degrade. So what has happened is that some of the paint layers have started to fade away on this painting, and we can now see bits of the underdrawing coming through. So you can see some sketch marks, and then you can also see a word here that says amarillo, which means yellow in Spanish. And so this tells us that he's doing certain parts of the painting, probably things like the faces, and then he's leaving certain areas for his assistants to come and fill in, and he's leaving them color notations. He does it again with the raising of Lazarus. So again, we have another pentimento coming through. So pentimento is just the word for something that should have been hidden, a mistake or an underdrawing, and then starts to show through after the passage of time. So here we have another word here. This is much more difficult to make out, but trust me, it does say blanco. So that's telling his assistants that Lazarus should be wearing white. Master Bartolome, we know less about him, and we're very lucky that that the Kimball and the Meadows and the Getty were able to confirm his identity, because prior to this, he was referred to as the Master of Sinister Faces, which is kind of a hilarious name. But once you start looking at the faces, I think you get an idea of why. Some people call this style feísmo, which means a sort of aesthetic ugliness. But Bartolome, it was very clear that there was another, master at work in our retablo, and he was referred to by that flattering nickname before we had his identity revealed. Bartolome seems to have also been working in Salamanca, but we don't know a lot about him. Thankfully, there is one work that is signed by him, and that is in the Prado Museum in Madrid. And you can see here, it's the Virgin and Child, and then we have his name, Bartolomeus, written in this stone or altar down below. And so what's incredible about that is that this painting can help to serve as sort of a touchstone for making other attributions for Bartolome's work. So, this helps to be a good comparison, having confirmation that this is by Master Bartolome, and being able to compare things like the faces and the hands and the underdrawing to other artworks that might be questionable in terms of authorship. So in terms of the way Bartolome worked, again, we don't know a lot about his life, but we do know that he definitely fancied German printmaking. So there are direct comparisons that can be made between some of the artworks in our retablo and popular German books and prints that were coming out at this time. So here is that chaos panel yet again. And here on the left-hand side, I'm showing you a hand-colored page from the Nuremberg Chronicle. So this was a book that was published in 1493. It was a very popular book, and you can sort of think of it as like an encyclopedia of Western Christian history. And so it details a lot of biblical events. So I'm showing you here sort of God the Father after he's created the universe. And I think you can see some similarities. We have this enthroned figure with the white beard wearing an almost papal-like crown, which is quite similar to our chaos panel. And then very clearly, I hope you can see the concentric circles. What I'm not showing you on this page is that in the previous pages of the Nuremberg Chronicle, it does detail what each ring is representing in terms of the steps of creation, whereas Bartolome is showing them sort of all together in one image. The creation of Eve, he also may have referenced the Nuremberg Chronicle for that. As you can see, Eve is emerging fully formed from Adam's ribcage. I love this painting. It's such a fun painting to explore. And here you can see the same thing is happening over here. I will say that the Nuremberg Chronicle is not the first example of Eve emerging from Adam's ribcage in this way. There are other earlier art examples of Eve being represented this way. It wasn't that uncommon. So it's possible he saw that somewhere else, but it's also very likely he saw it here. Certainly Salamanca would have been an easy place to get access to this book and other German prints. He was also interested in the work of Martin Schongauer. So here I'm showing you a print by that artist that's depicting a griffin. So griffin's like a mythological composite creature. Sometimes it's shown, like here is part eagle, part ox. Other times it's sort of an eagle / lion, but either way, we see this figure showing up right here. And even with the tongue sticking out and curled, it's very similar to this work. Now, one thing that's at least new to me, maybe you've already heard, is that there is a scholar in Spain, Juan Carlos Pascual de Cruz, and he actually has a theory that Master Bartolome left Spain after creating our retablo and traveled to Italy, where he worked under Luca Signorelli. And that's where his style sort of matured. And that possibly he was an artist who helped Signorelli with these beautiful frescoes that are in a monastery in sort of central Italy. So this artist was referred to as Lorenzo de Avila, and Juan Carlos believes that Lorenzo de Avila and Master Bartolome could be the same person. So we've been corresponding, we've sent him all kinds of images, and this is active research that he's doing. So stay tuned, you know, maybe he'll come out with some new publications. Okay, so now that we've taken a look at some of the basics of the display of the retablo, and we've taken a look at the subject matter and its creators, I want to start looking at kind of what was going on in Spain at the time, because while we're never going to be able to completely recreate a 15th century mentality, we can gain a certain understanding as to some of the significant moments that happened. And again, I think that will help us consider our own significant moment that we're going through right now. So here I'm showing you a slide of Isabella and Ferdinand, who are referred to as the Catholic monarchs. So they were in control of the majority of the peninsula at this time. So here I'm bringing up that map again. So here's the Iberian Peninsula. Now Isabella had inherited the Kingdom of Castile. So that's this gigantic pink area. Ferdinand had inherited the Kingdom of Aragon. And so when the two of them married, it effectively united them and gave them almost a monopoly over the peninsula. The Kingdom of Portugal, you know, at this point is remaining independent. The Kingdom of Navarre is still, you know, up here. And then the Kingdom of Granada, for a time, is still down here. This is going to change, though, in 1492. That's where this map ends in terms of the date. And I just want to briefly talk about the Kingdom of Granada, because this event in 1492 is significant, particularly when thinking about the religious fervor that's happening in Spain. So what this map is showing in the Kingdom of Granada is essentially the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. So in 711, the Muslims had come up and entered the peninsula through Northern Africa, and they settled all throughout the peninsula with the exception of the uppermost part of the peninsula. That remained mostly Christian. So immediately, though, the Christians begin what they refer to as the Reconquista, so the reconquering of the land. And for the following centuries, their goal is to push downward and downward to reclaim the land. Effectively, this was already done. So you can see in comparison, the Kingdom of Granada is not big. Really, the Reconquista was achieved in the late 13th century. And but conquering the Kingdom of Granada was very much a symbolic and ideological maneuver that the Catholic monarchs very much wanted to make. Not only because it would finally, you know, after many, many centuries, you know, send this symbol that Spain is Catholic, but there was also this perceived threat from the East, in that in 1453, Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Turks. And so, so definitely there was the strong desire for them to assert Catholicism on the entire peninsula. I'm just going to show you here, if you ever go to Granada, you can still go and visit the Alhambra, which is certainly the main attraction there for tourists. It's this absolutely incredible complex that's both palatial and fortress and military barracks and storage. And so this again was a symbolic takeover. You know, Ferdinand and Isabel definitely move in to the Alhambra. And you know, subsequently their grandson will build a church and a palace and add to this area. So 1492 also proves to be a really significant year for Spain because Ferdinand and Isabel, again with their Catholic fervor, decide to issue the Edict of Expulsion. The Edict of Expulsion is the official document to expel the Jews from the peninsula. This is, again, I wouldn't say it's symbolic. I mean, this happened, and lives were ruined as a result of it. But again, this was something that had been building up. So this is something that did not happen overnight. There were, numerous instances of anti-Semitism prior to this, and this essentially, was the last step. The Inquisition had already been established. There were already, forced conversions and ways to make the lives of Jews very difficult at this time, and this just kind of solidified it all. So you can find translations of this document. It's much longer than this. I'm just showing you the last 2 pages. It's very disturbing to read, reading the language that they use. And basically the argument is that, the Jews were warned time and again to stop being so wicked and to stop trying to, infect Christians with their wicked ways and their, delusional religious practices. And, we tried separating them and putting them in a different neighborhood, and that didn't work. They continued to do it. And so now they have 3 months to get out of the peninsula, or get out of Spain, I should say. And mind you, these people had been there for centuries. So to be given 3 months to completely leave was obviously a very shocking and sort of horrific decision. There is evidence of this in our retablo. Ciudad Rodrigo, being in such close proximity to Portugal, it actually does serve as a very important city for a lot of this conversation, because a lot of the Jews do end up fleeing from Spain and going into Portugal, and they flee through Ciudad Rodrigo. Many Jews who decided to convert perhaps would have been baptized at this cathedral. So definitely Ciudad Rodrigo was not unaware of these conversations that were happening at all. So evidence of this does come out in this painting, The Last Supper. So the Last Supper is where Jesus tells his disciples he knows one of them will betray him. And we see it revealed before us. So it becomes, once you take a look at it, it's kind of a busy image, but once you really look at each individual person, you can very clearly realize who Judas is. So he's seated here. He's holding his bag of money. So that was in exchange for revealing Jesus's identity. He has no halo. Certainly what he did is not saintly. But next to him is this man here who's holding his nose. And this has been interpreted to be an anti-Semitic gesture, not only because it references a lot of the stereotypes of the physical appearance of Jews, but it also references a lot of medieval writings that talk about Jews being malodorous. And so we have that here, plain as day, in our own retablo. Of course, it's hard to talk about the year 1492 without talking about Isabella and Ferdinand financing the voyage of Christopher Columbus. So this was certainly a momentous event, and again, it's something that really fueled the religious fervor. The fact that Columbus, quote unquote, discovered people who had no knowledge of Christ was considered to be a sign of God. So all of these events that I'm telling you about are considered to be sort of signs that the second coming might be happening and that Christ is coming, because these are all significant events, both good and bad, that are symbolizing his return. This voyage, of course, is what launches Spain into their golden age. And I encourage you to think about how that term has been used. It's certainly not the golden age for anybody who was native to the Americas, but I guess it's a golden age for Spain. But all of these things, and I failed to mention that there's also a reoccurrence of the plague. So all kinds of things are happening in Spain in the 15th century. There's a couple bouts of reoccurrences of the bubonic plague that devastate certain cities. And so a lot of this stuff is happening, and it's really making people think about the second coming of Christ and the possibilities of apocalypse. You know, what will happen in the year 1500? Will the world actually end? So, sorry, I didn't talk about this image. So I'm showing you, again, that retablo in the Cathedral of Salamanca. And you can see up here that there is a scene at the Last Judgment right above their beautiful retablo. And Last Judgment scenes are supposed to be terrifying. You know, that's kind of the point, is to imagine, you know, how this will happen, what will it look like, and what do we need to do to avoid this terrible fate. And that sort of encourages people to live good lives. But I'm just bringing Signorelli back real quick because I just want to stress that it's not just Spain where people are having these thoughts. Certainly it's happening in Italy and elsewhere. In the Cathedral of Orvieto, there's really stunning frescoes that talk about different phases of the apocalypse, and we can see that happening here. And then, of course, our own retablo ends with the Last Judgment. So, so our artists were definitely speaking about the sphere as well. And here we can see Christ at the top, and these people on his right hand, our left, as we're looking at this work, are saved, and then the right have a pretty dismal fate. And here's just a detail of that. So it is supposed to look scary, and some people really were scared at this time. But it wasn't all just about fear, because of course, the fear should inspire people to become very devoted and inspire people to think about the ways they're living their lives and to really contemplate Jesus and his sacrifice. And so that's partly what these paintings were supposed to inspire. So again, I'm bringing back the creation of Eve because it does mark sort of the beginning of the original sin. And then on the right-hand side, we have Jesus's sacrifice being crucified, you know, to redeem the original sin, essentially. These panels are painted with really incredible detail, and it's, and I admit it's a little hard for me to fully understand how much detail the average person would have seen at this time. Certainly people who, you know, worked at the church would have had, you know, special close to look at some of these paintings, but some of them would have hung quite high. And so details like these, you know, tiny drops of blood on his forehead or tears in people's eyes, you know, probably people wouldn't have seen them, but I imagine that for the artists, the act of creating these was their own act of devotion as well, and adding in those details would certainly have enhanced that. Here's the deposition. So just showing you another one that has a lot of real intense emotion and offers a lot of opportunity for people to really contemplate Jesus. So this, when I look at it, I almost see a Pietà because it's so centered on the Virgin Mary and Jesus. And the Pietà, it's not specifically outlined as a story in the Bible, but it's this moment that's been imagined by artists where it's this sort of private moment that Mary is mourning the death of her son, and often he's shown on her lap or something like that. But here the artist has shown their connection by enveloping them both in this white fabric and really showing that connection between mother and son. And here's just some details here. So again, these little details like the tear in her eye, and even the grotesque details of, you know, the blood and his muscles and veins. You know, he's made a great attempt to make Jesus really look like he has suffered. So these paintings, this is not the most elegant transition in topics, but these paintings, they hung in the cathedral for about 2 centuries or so, and then they were deemed out of fashion. That often does happen with artwork, that it goes out of style. And And eventually they made their way to Tucson, and we got the panels. I think the deal was finalized in 1961 or 62. And so they ended up at the University of Arizona Museum of Art. So here I'm just showing you the original site where they were located. What happened was that once they were taken down from the apse, they were stored in the cloister of the church. Probably, it's unclear exactly what that storage situation was like, but they did suffer quite a bit of damage, probably from being just out in the elements and just not very well cared for. They also suffered damage, and it's probably where we lost some of the panels during the Napoleonic Wars. So the cathedral was used as a lookout tower, and it was heavily bombed. And so one of the paintings we have in our collection, Ecce Homo, still has a hole in it, probably from cannon shrapnel or something like that during the war. Then what happened was that in the late 19th century or so, a dealer from Madrid came to the church. The church was at that time in need of money, and they made the decision to sell the panels to the dealer. Now it's interesting because in one of the sources, it talks about how the dealer purchased 29 paintings from the retablo. And so that fascinates me, you know, is that a typo? Because certainly 9 and 6, you know, are kind of opposites. Or are there 3 paintings that are still out there somewhere that could be part of our retablo? So it's just something to think about. But either way, 26 panels, or 29 panels were sold to this dealer. And then in turn, he ended up selling 26 panels to Sir Francis Cook, who was an art collector in England. And here I'm showing you, this is his conservatory or something, but here the retablo is, he made new frames for it, and it's just hanging up here in his house. Along with the Velasquez, I think, down there. So he was quite the collector. The panels end up getting stored in the United States during World War II, and then eventually they do get sold at auction and get sold to Samuel Kress, and that's where our story comes in. So some of you may have shopped at Kress stores throughout your life, but Samuel Kress owned a number of these 5 and dime chain stores all across the United States, and along the side he was collecting art. And then towards the end of his life, he decided to give it all away. And a lot of it went to the National Gallery, and then the rest of it went to different museums. Wherever he had a Kress store, you know, a museum there in that town would get part of the collection. His brother, Rush Kress, helped to distribute much of the collection because Samuel was really quite sick by the end of his life. And Rush Kress had a house in Tucson because his wife, Virginia, was from Tucson and went to school at the University of Arizona. And so they ensured that, that we got a large portion of the collection. So we have a total of 64 artworks, which includes the 26 panels from the altarpiece. So that's where I'm going to end, and I'll just return to this initial image that I showed you of these paintings hanging in our gallery. And again, I encourage us all to think about the place that art is going to have right now during this time, and the way that future art historians will look back on this time and kind of think about what changes happened, and again, find new ways of looking at other works of art that have also critiqued or commented on or illustrated other uncertain times in our world, because certainly having a visual helps us to get a grip on things, and can certainly help us process things, both good and bad, that are happening in our worlds. So with that, I thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer a few questions.
Thank you, Olivia. That was fantastic. Really appreciate the presentation. For those of you that are joining me virtually, which is all of you, you may not be used to being able to clap for someone at the end, but there is a button on most devices. It will say reactions, and if you would like to clap for Olivia, it looks like what I have put up in my corner. So we can give her a virtual round of applause. It was really fascinating and interesting. Thank you for that presentation, Olivia. So we only have a few minutes, but I did see a couple of questions that came in, so I was hoping we could spend the last couple minutes responding to those. The first question that came in was, why do you think the chaos panel has the caption of chaos, but none of the other panels do? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. And we, so I should say some of the other panels do have written words in them. I don't know if you can probably barely see this, but there are a number of paintings that have these sort of ribbon-like, you can almost think of them as like a cartoon speech bubble, but they come out in ribbons. So there are other paintings that have written words in them, but I will say that the chaos panel is unique. You know, it's obviously written in a very different way. And there have also been people who have disputed that it even says chaos, that the H doesn't really look like an H, and is that even what it's really saying? There's also a word in the middle that's spelled H-I-L-L-E, and some people have questioned that use. Does that mean the word matter? So long answer to your question is I have no idea. But I think by far the chaos panel is definitely the most mysterious one of them all, because it is so outside the box from the other panels. And maybe that helps center the altarpiece, you know, and maybe instead of a sculptural element, chaos was in the middle and these other panels surrounded it. It's really hard to know. What's interesting is that this panel was included in an exhibition in Leuven, Belgium, in celebration of the 500th anniversary of Thomas More's Utopia. So other scholars have looked at it, really interested in the way it interprets the creation of the universe and the way people pictured that.
Yeah, that's great. It's certainly one of the most interesting of the panels for sure. I think I look at it and see something new every single time. For sure. So I can't wait until we're all back and able to come into the museum again, and we'll all look at it with fresh eyes. Okay, we do have a question. One of the questions was Spanish the primary language of Spain or the Iberian Peninsula during the 15th century?
That's a good question. I mean, Castilian, I think, was certainly spoken, but I think we also have to remember that Spain is such a unique part of Europe. Geographically, it's quite separated because it's on that peninsula, and it's separated by France from the Pyrenees Mountains. So a lot of these cultural things are quite unique to Spain, and certainly Arabic would have been spoken throughout a large part of the continent for quite some time, and probably Hebrew as well.
Super, thank you. All right, we only have about 1 minute left, but one of the questions that I know we get asked a lot at the museum is about the black arches along the top of the paintings. I'm not sure if everybody noticed that as we went through them, but they're on the top of all of the paintings. Can you tell us why those are there?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. We do get this question a lot, and they're actually not original to the paintings. So as I mentioned, these paintings used to be framed. So in reality, the top parts of the paintings would not have been painted at all. And so a conservator in the 1950s made the decision to mark these black lines on every panel to show where the frames originally were, and then to paint the upper part. This is a decision that it would be interesting to see if these panels were conserved today, if a conservator would want to do that type of in-painting, because it's quite a lot. But I will say that conservators really have to strike a balance between protecting a painting, providing ideal viewership for the viewer, but also not going too far and taking away the artist's hand. And so this is, I think it's a little bit questionable, but I also but it does allow for visual cohesion. So people can really enjoy the paintings without being distracted by the lack of a frame.
Super. Well, we've already hit 4:30. That was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Olivia. Again, round of applause. I really appreciate you doing this virtually for everyone. And thank you all so much for coming out and joining the Museum of Art today. If you are not already on our mailing list, as Chelsea put on, please consider joining. You can do that through our website. We're also on Facebook and Instagram. And in fact, tomorrow at 1 o'clock, we'll be doing an Instagram Live. I hope you can join us for that. Those are fun. They're only 15 minutes. but a really enjoyable break in your day. So thank you all. Great presentation, Olivia, and we hope to see you at our next virtual event.
Feel free to email us if you have any questions that I didn't get to. I'd be happy to try to respond via email. So thank you.
Definitely. We love working from home, so keep reaching out to us. We're still available. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you later.